The wood of the chair groaned against the marble floor of the Bucks County Country Club. I had just placed my hand on the napkin ring when the seat jerked backward, pulling out from under my fingers. I caught my balance on the edge of the table and turned around. My younger sister Jessica stood there. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the carved back of my chair. The skirt of her custom silk wedding gown swept the floor, rustling in the sudden quiet. For a second I thought she was making room for the photographer. Then her eyes met mine. "This table is for family," she said. Her voice carried over the string quartet. "Not you." The clinking of silverware stopped. A waiter froze mid-step near the ice sculpture. I looked down at the gold-rimmed plate in front of me. The place card clearly read, Evelyn Brown. I was in the right seat. Jessica had assigned it to me 3 weeks earlier. I looked back up at her face. Panic was hiding just behind her glare, a tight, forced expression she always wore when she was trying to control a narrative. "You moved my seat because I refused to sign your buyout contract," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Do not pretend this is about family." Her grip on the chair tightened. "This is my wedding," she said. "You do not get to dictate what happens here. Get out of my sight." Every guest at the head table was watching me. They were waiting for me to yell, to cry, or to throw a drink. I gave her none of that. I simply picked up my leather purse, straightened my blazer, and turned toward the main doors. Before I tell you what happened when I took my first step, I want to welcome you to Grape Vengeance. I would love to know how old you are and what state or country you are watching from today. Drop your age and location in the comments, and please take a second to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of this story. I had taken maybe 5 steps across the ballroom when I heard the sharp scrape of wooden legs on marble. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. Grandma Helen stood at the far end of the head table. She was 78 years old, wearing a simple gray suit that Jessica had complained was too plain for the photographs. Helen ignored her then, and she ignored her now. She placed her linen napkin over her untouched plate. She picked up her handbag. Grandma Jessica said, her voice pitching up. "What are you doing?" Helen did not answer. She walked around the table and stepped in line behind me. Then the sound of chairs moving echoed across the room like falling dominoes. My Aunt Sarah stood up. My Uncle Robert stood next. 4 of my cousins pushed their plates away and gathered their coats. The loyalists in the Brown family did not shout or make a scene. They just stood up and turned their backs on the bride. Jessica stepped forward, her face draining of color. "You are all walking out of my wedding because Evelyn did not get her way?" she yelled. Nobody answered her. The silence was worse than any insult. I pushed open the double doors and walked into the hallway. By the time I reached the lobby, 40 members of our family had followed me out. We left an enormous void in a ballroom designed for 200 people. The entire left side of the room was a ghost town. I stood near the coat check, pulling my keys from my purse. The heavy ballroom doors swung open again. David the groom stood in the threshold. His face was flushed red. His eyes darted between the 40 people putting on their jackets and his new wife standing alone at the ruined head table. The champagne flute he was holding slipped from his fingers. The glass shattered against the floor, sending shards scattering across the polished tile. "What did you do?" David screamed at Jessica, his voice cracked, echoing into the lobby. I did not stay to hear her answer. I walked out the front doors of the country club and into the crisp Pennsylvania evening air. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked toward my car. The rest of the family followed, forming a quiet crowd in the parking lot. Aunt Sarah wrapped her scarf around her neck and looked at me. "She expects you to come back in there and apologize," Sarah said. I unlocked my car doors. "She is going to be waiting a long time." My phone buzzed inside my purse. I pulled it out. The screen lit up the dark interior of my car. It was a text message from David. It read, "Evelyn, please answer me. She is locking herself in the bridal suite. What contract was she talking about?" I stared at the glowing letters. David thought this was about a wedding seating chart. He had no idea his new wife had spent the last 3 weeks trying to strip my shares from the logistics company I spent 7 years saving. He did not know about the debt. He did not know the woman he just married was drowning in financial secrets. I slid the phone back into my pocket without replying. I do not negotiate with emotional people, and I never explain myself over a text message. If David wanted the truth about Jessica, he was going to have to look at the paperwork himself. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life. I knew Jessica would try to spin this to our parents. I knew she would paint me as the villain who ruined her perfect day. But Jessica had made a fatal error. She picked a public fight with the only person holding the receipts to her actual life. The dashboard clock glowed a faint blue in the dark interior of my car. The screen of my phone lit up again, casting a harsh light against the center console. Another text from David. I watched his name flash across the glass, then turned the device face down. I do not engage with panic. Arguing with emotional people is a waste of breath. My grandmother Helen opened the passenger door and slid into the leather seat beside me. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer empty platitudes or pity. She simply pulled her seatbelt across her chest and looked straight ahead through the windshield. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the country club parking lot. Back inside the venue, the reception was actively collapsing. The string quartet had stopped playing their instruments. The remaining guests were whispering in huddled groups, staring at the empty chairs lining the left side of the room. Waiters stood frozen near the kitchen doors, holding heavy trays of untouched appetizers, unsure of where to go. David did not care about the whispering guests or the ruined expensive food. He grabbed Jessica by the elbow and pulled her out of the ballroom. He marched her down the velvet-lined hallway and pushed open the door to the bridal suite. He pulled her inside and closed the heavy wooden door behind them, shutting out the noise of the ruined party. "What is going on?" David asked. His voice was low and tight, vibrating with restrained anger. Jessica immediately crumbled into a performance. She threw herself onto the plush velvet sofa and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she forced out a dramatic sob. "Evelyn has always hated me," Jessica cried, wiping away tears that conveniently avoided smudging her perfect makeup. She could not stand that today was about me. She orchestrated that entire walkout just to ruin my wedding. She is jealous, David. She has always been jealous of my success. David stood in the center of the room. He did not rush forward to comfort her. He did not sit beside her on the sofa and stroke her hair. David was a senior accountant for a corporate firm in Philadelphia. His entire career was built on identifying discrepancies and analyzing patterns. He looked at his new wife, evaluating her words. Her story had gaping holes. Evelyn was cold, calculating, and laser-focused on her business. Evelyn did not care about attention or social status. The math of a jealous sibling rivalry simply did not add up. Jessica stood up and walked into the attached bathroom to splash water on her face. She left her designer clutch on the vanity table. Her cell phone rested next to it. The screen lit up with a notification. It vibrated loudly against the polished wood. David took a step closer. He did not mean to snoop, but his eyes caught the banner glaring on the screen. It was an alert from a high-risk credit bank he did not recognize. The notification read, "Payment overdue. Please submit funds immediately to avoid default proceedings." The phone buzzed again. A second notification appeared from a different lender. This one was a warning about a maxed-out credit limit on a platinum card. David stared at the glowing screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The color drained from his face. Jessica had told him her online lifestyle brand was thriving. She claimed her lucrative influencer sponsorships were paying for the custom silk dress, the towering floral arrangements, and the imported champagne flowing in the ballroom. She had insisted on handling all the wedding finances through her business accounts to maximize her tax write-offs. David had trusted her. Now, looking at the collection notices flooding her screen, the truth clicked into place with crushing clarity. There were no brand deals. The lifestyle income was fake. The wedding was built on a precarious mountain of high-interest consumer debt. Jessica was hiding a financial disaster, and they had just signed a marriage certificate connecting his pristine credit score to her hidden liabilities. He realized with sickening certainty that his new wife had trapped him. 15 miles away, Helen and I sat in a faded vinyl booth at a 24-hour diner. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a harsh glare over the room. The smell of cheap burnt coffee and fried potatoes filled the air. It was a sharp contrast to the crystal chandeliers of the country club, but it was quiet, and I needed quiet. The waitress set 2 ceramic mugs of black coffee on the laminated table and walked away without asking questions. Helen wrapped her hands around her warm mug. She looked at me over the rim, her expression unreadable. "You could have caused a scene in that ballroom," Helen said, her voice steady. "You had every right to yell. You chose to walk away instead. Tell me why." I reached into my leather tote bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and grabbed the thick manila folder I had been carrying all day. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the sticky diner table. I looked at the woman who had helped raise me. Helen was sharp. She knew I did not make emotional or impulsive decisions. 7 years ago, our family logistics company, Brown Freight, was weeks away from total bankruptcy. My father had mismanaged the corporate accounts, ignored the rising diesel fuel costs, and trusted the wrong vendors. I was 25 years old when I stepped into the chaos. I drained my own personal savings to meet the payroll. I worked 80-hour weeks, renegotiating vendor contracts, firing lazy warehouse managers, and rebuilding our dispatch routes from the ground up. I spent my youth smelling like exhaust and stale coffee to save our legacy. For my sweat and my capital, I earned a 40% managing stake. My parents retained 50%. Jessica held a quiet 10%. She never worked a single day on the loading dock. I slid the folder across the table toward Helen. "I did not get kicked out over a seating arrangement," I said. "I got kicked out because of this." Helen set her coffee down and flipped the folder open. Inside was a 30-page corporate restructuring document. "Jessica presented this to me 3 weeks ago," I explained, keeping my voice devoid of any emotion. "She told our parents it was a standard modernization plan to help the company secure better commercial insurance rates. She told them it was just routine paperwork, a simple update to the bylaws. My parents did not read it. They never read anything involving legal jargon, but I read every single line." I leaned forward and tapped my finger on the 3rd page of the thick packet. "Look at Section 4, I said. Helen adjusted her glasses and read the fine print. I watched her eyes widen as she processed the legal language. The document was a disguised hostile buyout. It contained a buried clause that would dilute my shares from 40% down to 15%. It stripped me of my executive voting rights and transferred operational control directly to Jessica. The final page outlined a profit-sharing restructure. Jessica was trying to secure the legal authority to siphon Brown Freight revenues directly into her failing lifestyle brand. She wanted to use our trucks, our loyal drivers, and our hard-earned profit margins to fund her luxury life, and she needed my signature to make it legal. When I refused to sign it 3 weeks ago, I said she realized I was the only thing standing between her and a blank check. She could not force me out legally. So she decided to humiliate me publicly. She thought if she isolated me from the family, if she broke me down in front of everyone we knew at her reception, I would cave and sign the paperwork just to be accepted back into the fold. Helen traced the deceptive lines of the contract with her index finger. A deep sigh escaped her lips. The sound was heavy with bitter disappointment. "She tried to steal your company," Helen whispered, looking up at me. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The bitter liquid burned the back of my throat, grounding me in the moment. "She tried," I corrected her. But Jessica made a severe miscalculation. She assumed I cared about being liked. She assumed I valued a designated seat at her table more than I valued the company I built with my own hands. I reached across the table and closed the manila folder. I had the paperwork to prove her attempted theft, but I knew my sister. She was desperate to maintain her image. Desperate people do not just stop when their first plan fails. If she was bold enough to draft this fraudulent contract, she was bold enough to find another way to get her hands on the company money. Tomorrow morning, I was going to the corporate office to find out exactly how far she had gone, and I was prepared to burn her false reality to the ground. Monday morning began before the sun even crested the Pennsylvania hills. My alarm buzzed at 5:15, but I was already awake, staring at the ceiling of my townhouse. The silence of the early hours was my sanctuary. I did not have a headache from drinking imported champagne. I did not have a frantic husband demanding answers about hidden credit card debt. I just had clarity. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, strapped my watch to my wrist, and poured a dark roast coffee into a stainless steel travel mug. The drive to Harrisburg took 40 minutes. The rhythmic hum of the highway tires over the pavement offered a quiet space to strategize. The chaotic walkout at the country club was merely the opening move of a much larger game. Today, the battlefield shifted from a wedding reception to a corporate boardroom. Gripping the leather steering wheel, my mind drifted back to the initial spark of this war. 3 weeks ago, Jessica had marched into my office. She wore a designer trench coat that cost more than a standard monthly mortgage payment. She carried a pristine leather portfolio, smiling that tight, practiced smile she used whenever she wanted something expensive. She dropped a thick stack of stapled papers onto my desk, claiming it was a routine modernization initiative to secure better commercial insurance rates. Our parents, Richard and Diane, had already given her their blessing. They never read the fine print. They preferred the illusion of peace over the uncomfortable reality of business. But I read every single line. I remembered the exact moment my pen stopped hovering over the signature block. I flipped to page 12. There it was, buried under layers of dense legal jargon, a clause designed to strip my executive voting rights. Another clause to dilute my equity. A final addendum granting Jessica the authority to route corporate profit dividends directly into a shell company for her failing lifestyle brand. I had looked up at her perfectly contoured face, handed the pen back, and told her no. The silence in my office had turned thick and heavy. She did not yell. She merely stared at me with cold calculation, gathered her fraudulent papers, and walked out without a word. She had spent her 20s touring European vineyards, swiping our parents' high-limit credit cards, and curating an artificial online persona. I spent my 20s buried in freight manifests, negotiating with stubborn diesel suppliers, and sleeping on a cot in the back office. When I was 25 years old, Brown Freight was weeks away from total bankruptcy due to my father trusting the wrong logistics vendors. I drained my own personal savings to meet the payroll. I worked grueling 80-hour weeks, firing lazy warehouse managers and rebuilding our dispatch routes from the ground up. I earned my 40% managing stake through sheer grit and undeniable results. I was not about to hand over my life's work so my little sister could fund her fake empire. The familiar gravel lot of the corporate office came into view. The morning mist hung low over the idling 18-wheelers. The smell of exhaust, damp asphalt, and wet pine filled my lungs as I stepped out of my sedan. This place was my territory. I knew the name of every driver. I knew the maintenance schedule of every truck. I knew the exact profit margin on every delivery route running down the East Coast. I walked up the concrete steps toward the glass double doors of the main lobby. I pulled my standard silver office key from my pocket and slid it into the cylinder. It hit a wall of fresh metal. I tried again, pushing slightly, assuming the old tumblers were just sticking in the morning cold. The key refused to turn. The pins had been entirely swapped. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the pristine brass fitting. The scratches from years of use were gone. They had changed the locks over the weekend. The glass door suddenly swung open from the inside. A security guard I had never seen before stepped into the threshold, blocking the entrance. He wore a crisp, unwrinkled uniform and a smug grin. He held a laminated clipboard pressed against his chest. "Can I help you?" he asked. His tone dripped with unearned authority. I looked at his silver name tag. Marcus. "I am Evelyn Brown," I said, keeping my voice even and calm. "I am the managing partner of this firm, and my key seems to be malfunctioning." Marcus did not look surprised. He flipped a page on his clipboard, ran his finger down a printed list, and tapped his pen against the paper. "Actually, Miss Brown, you are no longer authorized to enter the premises. I have direct orders from the company president, Richard Brown. If you try to force entry, I am instructed to contact local law enforcement." My father. The man whose retirement I secured when I pulled this dying company out of the gutter. He had chosen the golden child. After the catastrophic walkout at the wedding, Richard and Diane had clearly panicked. Instead of demanding answers from Jessica about her high-interest debt or the hostile buyout attempt, they chose to punish me for exposing the cracks in her perfect facade. They thought locking me out of the building would strip away my leverage. They thought cutting my physical access would frighten me into bending the knee and signing her contract to save my job. They wanted to erase me from the very foundation I built. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not shake. I did not raise my voice, threaten Marcus with a lawsuit, or demand to speak to my father. Giving this hired guard a reaction would only feed Jessica's narrative that I was an unstable, jealous sibling causing a scene. I nodded slowly, looking Marcus dead in the eye. "Understood," I said softly. I turned around and walked down the concrete steps. Marcus chuckled a quiet, arrogant sound behind my back, assuming he had won. He watched me walk back toward the parking lot, confident that I was defeated. But I did not walk to my car. I walked around the side of the brick building, my heels clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement. I headed straight for the rear loading dock. The corporate office had a fancy front door with a digital security system and a hired guard. But the warehouse in the back was a different story. I reached deep into the hidden pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy, worn brass key. It was the original key the former owner handed me 7 years ago, when I first took over operations. My father and sister thought they could lock me out of Brown Freight. They forgot one crucial detail about the corporate structure. The company rented the office space from a third-party vendor. But 3 years ago, during a severe cash flow crisis, the landlord threatened to evict the fleet. I personally bought the physical real estate through a private trust to keep the bank from foreclosing on the lot. My father was so passive he merely signed the transfer paperwork without reading the name of the purchasing entity. They could change the locks on the glass doors all they wanted. I owned the dirt beneath their feet. I slid the brass key into the heavy iron door of the loading dock. It turned with a satisfying click. The heavy iron door closed behind me with a loud thud, cutting off the crisp chill of the Pennsylvania morning. I stepped onto the concrete floor of the warehouse. The air inside smelled of motor oil, damp cardboard, and the faint metallic tang of diesel fumes. Forklifts beeped in the distance, their yellow warning lights flashing against the gray walls. The overnight crew was busy loading wooden pallets onto the outgoing fleet. Thomas, our lead dispatcher, caught my eye from the center loading bay. He gave me a quick nod, noticing I had bypassed the front lobby and the new security guard. I nodded back and walked straight toward the elevated glass office that overlooked the warehouse floor. Through the large glass panes, I could see my parents waiting inside. Richard sat behind his sprawling oak desk, staring down at a stack of shipping manifests. Diane paced the narrow carpet, clutching a designer leather handbag against her hip. She wore a tailored beige pantsuit and a rigid, furious expression. They looked like they were bracing for a fight. They expected me to burst through the door, screaming about Marcus, the security guard, and the changed locks. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned the brass doorknob, pushed open the office door, and stepped inside quietly. Diane stopped pacing the moment the door clicked shut. Her eyes narrowed into thin slits. She did not ask how I got past the front desk. She skipped right over the logistics and went straight for the attack. "You ruined your sister's special day," Diane snapped. Her voice was sharp, carrying the same entitled pitch Jessica always used when she did not get her way. "You humiliated her in front of David and his entire family. You made a public spectacle out of a simple business disagreement." I stood near the coat rack. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. "A simple business disagreement," I repeated. "She tried to steal my equity. She handed me a fraudulent contract designed to funnel corporate profits into her fake lifestyle brand." Diane waved her manicured hand through the air, dismissing my words as if I were a complaining child. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Evelyn. Jessica just needs a financial boost to start her new life. She has expensive tastes, and her new husband has high expectations. We are a family. We help each other. You have more than enough money sitting in your bank accounts. It is incredibly selfish of you to hoard your success when your sister is trying to build a foundation." I looked past Diane to the man sitting behind the oak desk. Richard, the president of Brown Freight. The man who had driven this logistics firm straight into the ground before I bailed him out 7 years ago. He refused to meet my gaze. He kept his eyes glued to the papers on his desk, his shoulders hunched forward in a defensive posture. "Dad?" I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Are you seriously going to sit there and let her defend a hostile buyout?" Richard shifted in his leather chair. He cleared his throat but kept his head down. "Your mother is right, Evelyn," he mumbled. "Jessica is young. She made a minor mistake with the wording of that contract, but her heart is in the right place. We need to move past this. We need to keep the peace." Diane stepped closer to me. The scent of her expensive floral perfume overpowered the smell of diesel rising from the warehouse below. "There is only one way to fix this mess," Diane said. "You are going to call Jessica right now. You are going to apologize for your little stunt at the reception, and then you are going to sign the restructuring documents she gave you. If you refuse, your father and I are prepared to terminate your position at Brown Freight effective immediately." The room went dead silent. The threat hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Terminate my position. They actually thought they had the power to fire me from the empire I resurrected. I stared at the two people who raised me. I felt a strange, icy calm wash over my chest. The last lingering thread of daughterly loyalty snapped cleanly in half. For years I had justified their behavior. I told myself they were just bad with money, not cruel. I told myself they favored Jessica because she was the youngest and needed more guidance. But standing in that office, the truth was undeniable. They had chosen the golden child. They were willing to sacrifice the daughter who saved their retirement just to protect the daughter who wanted to drain it. I did not argue. I did not yell about the 80-hour weeks I worked to keep this company afloat. I did not remind Richard that his pension only existed because of my sweat and capital. Pleading with them was useless. I needed raw data to figure out exactly what they were hiding. "Fine," I said. My voice was smooth, betraying zero emotion. "I will consider signing the restructuring agreement. But I need to see the updated corporate ledger first. I need to review the quarterly profit margins before I surrender my voting rights." Richard finally looked up from his desk. His jaw tightened. He shot a nervous, panicked glance at Diane. "You do not need to see the ledger," Richard said quickly, his voice wavering. "The accounts are stable. Just sign the papers, Evelyn." His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. They were hiding something much worse than a bad contract. I nodded slowly. I walked past Diane and headed straight for my personal desk in the far corner of the office. My computer monitor was dark. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and tapped the spacebar. The login screen flashed to life. They had locked my physical keycard out of the front door, but they had not unhooked my terminal from the network. Richard stood up from his chair. "Evelyn, step away from that desk," he warned. I ignored him. I typed my standard password. A red error message popped up on the screen. "Access denied." They had revoked my administrative privileges over the weekend. Diane crossed her arms and offered a smug smile. "I told you, Evelyn. You are locked out until you cooperate." She thought she had won. But she did not understand technology, and neither did Richard. When I rebuilt the IT infrastructure for Brown Freight 5 years ago, I knew my father had a habit of making careless digital mistakes. I knew he clicked on phishing links and downloaded sketchy attachments. So I coded a hidden backdoor admin protocol deep into the master server registry, just in case of an emergency. This qualified as an emergency. I opened the command prompt window. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a string of encrypted override codes. The black screen flashed green. A new window popped up, granting me direct, unfiltered access to the root directory of the corporate server. Richard walked around his desk, his face turning pale. "What are you doing?" he demanded, stepping toward me. I pulled a sleek, encrypted hard drive from my blazer pocket and plugged it into the USB port. I initiated a forced download of the entire financial history. 7 years of ledgers, tax returns, vendor payouts, and bank authorizations began transferring onto my drive. A blue progress bar appeared on my screen, ticking upward. 10%, 30%. Diane rushed forward and reached for the power cord to unplug my machine. I shot my hand out and grabbed her wrist. My grip was firm, locking her arm in place. "Do not touch that," I said, staring directly into her eyes. She gasped and pulled her hand back, shocked by my cold, uncompromising tone. The download hit 90%. As the files zipped across the screen, a secondary folder caught my eye. It was located in a restricted subdirectory under Richard's personal account. The folder was labeled Riverfront Expansion. I frowned. Brown Freight did not have any expansion plans. We were a regional logistics hub. We had never done business with Riverfront Bank. My finger hovered over the mouse. The download finished, and I safely unhooked my encrypted hard drive, sliding it back into my pocket. But I kept the server window open. I clicked on the Riverfront folder. A single PDF document appeared on the screen. I opened it. It was a formal commercial loan application. The header displayed the official logo for Riverfront Bank. I scrolled down the digital pages, my eyes scanning the fine print. Someone had applied for a $500,000 commercial line of credit, using our entire fleet of freight trucks as collateral. If the loan defaulted, the bank would seize every single truck in our yard, effectively destroying the business overnight. I scrolled to the very last page to check the guarantor section. My blood ran cold. The breath hitched in my throat. There, resting on the digital signature line, was my name. The handwriting was a near-perfect match to my own script. But I had never seen this document before in my life. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was no longer just a greedy corporate power grab or a petty family squabble. My sister had forged my signature on federal bank documents, and the ticking clock on her financial destruction had just started. I stared at the glowing monitor. My name sat on the digital signature line of the commercial loan application. It was a very good forgery. The loop of the E was perfectly rounded, and the slant of the letters mimicked my own handwriting closely. But the tail of the Y was entirely wrong. It dragged down too sharply. I recognized that sharp tail. When we were teenagers, Jessica used to practice tracing my signature in her spiral notebooks so she could steal cash from my summer job paychecks. Back then, it was $50. Today, it was $500,000. My mind moved quickly, organizing the timeline of her deception. Jessica had always believed the rules did not apply to her. Growing up, if she broke a vase, she blamed the dog. If she wrecked a car, my parents bought her a new one to soothe her anxiety. But forging a signature on a corporate bank document was not a broken vase. It was a felony, carrying a mandatory prison sentence. She had taken her lifelong entitlement and weaponized it into a federal offense. 3 weeks ago, Jessica walked into this exact office and demanded I sign her hostile buyout contract. She claimed it was for insurance purposes. That was a lie. She needed my legal authorization because a commercial bank will never approve a substantial loan against a corporate fleet without the consent of the managing partner. When I looked her in the eye and refused to hand over my voting rights, her plan crumbled. She was drowning in secret high-interest credit card debt. She had a $100,000 wedding approaching and a luxury duplex to fund. She needed cash immediately. So she took the shortest route possible. She stole it. This was no longer a petty sibling rivalry over a wedding seating chart. This was not a simple disagreement about profit sharing. This was bank fraud. Jessica had leveraged the entire fleet of brown freight trucks to secure a substantial line of credit. If she defaulted on those payments, Riverfront Bank would send repo men to our loading dock. They would seize every 18-wheeler we owned. The company I spent 7 years saving would be liquidated in a matter of days, leaving 30 loyal employees without a paycheck. I did not gasp. I did not scream at my father. I kept my breathing slow and steady. I dragged my mouse across the screen and clicked the print icon. Across the room, the heavy office printer hummed to life. The machine whirred, spitting out warm pages of paper. Richard jumped in his leather chair. Diane stopped glaring at me and looked at the tray catching the documents. "What are you printing?" Richard demanded, his voice thick with sudden anxiety. I stood up from my ergonomic chair. I walked over to the machine and gathered the stack of warm papers. I tapped the bottom edge against the desk to align the edges, then folded them neatly in half. "Just some personal files," I replied, my voice smooth as glass. I slid the folded application into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. I turned back to the computer, safely ejected my encrypted hard drive, and dropped it into my purse. Diane took a quick step toward me, blocking my path to the door. "You are not leaving this room until you fix what you broke," Diane snapped. "You owe your sister an apology for leaving her reception. You owe David an apology for making his new bride cry." I looked at the woman standing in front of me. She had no idea her youngest daughter had just committed a felony. If I confronted them right now, Diane would immediately call Jessica to warn her. Jessica would log into the portal, delete the digital traces, and shred any physical copies she kept at her apartment. I needed to lock the trap before the mouse even realized she was standing on the spring. "I do not owe anyone a single breath of my time," I replied softly. "And you should be very careful about demanding apologies before you know the actual truth." Richard slammed his fist onto the oak desk. "Do not speak to your mother that way, Evelyn. We are the majority shareholders here." "No, Dad," I corrected him. "You are the people who let the inmates run the asylum. I suggest you check your blind spots before you tell me how to drive." I stepped around my mother, pushed the glass door open, and walked out of the office. I walked down the metal stairs of the warehouse. The loud hum of the diesel engines masked the sound of my footsteps. I passed Thomas on the loading dock. I gave him a reassuring nod, pushed through the heavy iron exit door, and stepped back into the brisk morning air. I climbed into my sedan and locked the doors. I pulled my phone from my purse and searched for the nearest branch of Riverfront Bank. There was a corporate commercial office located 12 miles away in downtown Harrisburg. I put the car in drive and left the gravel lot. The Pennsylvania highway stretched out before me, lined with tall evergreen trees. I turned the radio off. I needed total silence. My mind calculated the exact sequence of events that would follow. Once I froze the account, the bank internal fraud department would launch a mandatory investigation. They would audit the network addresses used to submit the online portions of the application. They would pull security footage from the branch where Jessica submitted the physical paperwork. She had left a trail of breadcrumbs wide enough for a blind investigator to follow. She was arrogant, and arrogance makes people remarkably sloppy. The drive took 20 minutes. I used that time to rehearse my exact phrasing. Emotional people get escorted out of bank lobbies by security. Calm, factual people get things done. I parked my car in the visitor structure and walked into the grand lobby of Riverfront Bank. The floors were polished white marble. The air smelled of expensive cologne and sterile cleaning supplies. I bypassed the standard teller lines and walked directly to the mahogany reception desk located in the commercial lending wing. "Good morning," I said to the receptionist. "I am Evelyn Brown, managing partner of Brown Freight. I need to speak with the senior commercial loan officer immediately regarding an active application." The receptionist typed my name into her terminal. Her posture straightened when she saw the account details. "Right away, Miss Brown," she replied. A few minutes later, a man in a sharp navy suit walked out of a glass corner office. He extended his hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison. He guided me into his private workspace and closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the lobby. He sat behind his desk and smiled a polite, professional smile. He tried to offer me a complimentary bottle of sparkling water. I declined. I did not want hospitality. I wanted swift, irreversible action. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Miss Brown," Mr. Harrison said. "We have been processing the expansion loan your sister submitted. Everything looks to be in perfect order. The final funds are scheduled to disperse into the corporate account by tomorrow morning. How can I assist you today?" I sat in the leather guest chair. I did not return his smile. I reached into my blazer and pulled out the folded pages I had printed at the warehouse. I smoothed them out on the edge of his desk and slid them across the polished wood. "Mr. Harrison," I said evenly, "I need you to pull the physical file for this application." He blinked, clearly confused by my cold tone. He turned to his filing cabinet, unlocked a heavy drawer, and pulled out a thick blue folder. He opened it on his desk, revealing the original ink-signed documents Jessica had submitted. I pointed to the final page of the paperwork sitting in his blue folder. "Look at the managing partner authorization line," I instructed. He looked down at the signature. "Yes," he said slowly. "That is your signature, approving the collateral lien against the freight fleet." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of his desk. I looked him dead in the eye. "That is not my handwriting," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a falling anvil. "I have never seen this document before in my life. I did not authorize this line of credit. The woman who submitted this application forged my name to secure $500,000. The color drained from the face of the loan officer. His professional demeanor vanished, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. A fraudulent commercial loan of this magnitude was a career-ending disaster for a lending officer. His hands visibly shook as he stared at the forged ink. "Are you certain?" he stammered, wiping a thin bead of sweat from his forehead. I pulled my driver license and my passport card from my wallet. I placed them next to the forged document. "Compare the signatures," I said. "The tale of the Y is entirely different. This application is a federal crime." He leaned over the desk, scrutinizing the identification cards. He swallowed hard. The silence in the office stretched thin. "Miss Brown, if this is truly a forgery, our legal department will have to involve the authorities," he cautioned, his voice trembling. "I expect nothing less," I replied. "I am willing to sign a sworn affidavit right now. My sister committed identity theft and bank fraud. Protect your institution, Mr. Harrison, because I am certainly protecting mine." He scrambled for his computer mouse. He clicked frantically through his banking software. "Yes, of course," he breathed, his voice tight. "I am flagging the file right now." "I am initiating a formal fraud freeze on this account immediately," I declared. "Do not process the disbursement. Lock down every single pending transfer associated with Brown Freight or Jessica Brown." I watched the screen as a bright red lock icon appeared next to the account number. The funds were frozen. Nothing would clear. I felt a deep, satisfying calm settle in my chest. Jessica had built her entire future on a mountain of stolen money. She thought she had secured the $500,000 to pay off her hidden credit cards, fund her lavish wedding, and close on her luxury duplex. She thought she was untouchable. She did not know her money was gone. She did not know her pending transfers were about to hit a brick wall. And worst of all, she did not know I was the one who built the wall. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and thanked Mr. Harrison for his prompt assistance. I walked out of the bank with my head held high. The ticking time bomb was officially set. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was corporate payroll day. When Jessica tried to move funds around to cover her tracks, the explosion was going to shatter her perfect life into 1,000 unfixable pieces. Friday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the Pennsylvania hills. I sat at my kitchen counter, nursing my second cup of black coffee. The digital clock on the stove flipped to 7. This was the exact hour the direct deposits were scheduled to hit the bank accounts of our 30 warehouse employees. I expected a quiet morning of planning my next legal maneuver. Instead, my phone vibrated across the granite island. The caller ID flashed the name Thomas. Our lead dispatcher never called me this early unless a truck was overturned on the interstate. I slid my thumb across the screen and answered. Before I could even say, "Good morning," Thomas barked into the receiver. His voice was thick with rage and panic. "The paychecks bounced," Evelyn Thomas said, breathing hard. "Every single one of them. The guys are furious. We have drivers threatening to barricade the loading dock with their rigs." I set my coffee mug down. My mind raced, piecing together the timeline. I had frozen the riverfront commercial loan less than 24 hours ago. Jessica must have logged into the corporate banking portal late last night, expecting to see her stolen $500,000 ready for withdrawal. When she saw the bright red fraud lock instead, panic must have set in. Today was the closing date for her luxury duplex. She needed a staggering deposit to secure the keys. Without the bank funds, she was trapped. So she did the unthinkable. She illegally transferred the entire weekly payroll reserve out of the company operating account and wired it straight to her personal escrow. "Are the men still on the property?" I asked, keeping my tone measured. "They are standing in the gravel lot," Thomas replied. "I just walked into the front office to demand answers. Jessica was already sitting at your desk. She looked like a cornered animal. When I told her the men had families to feed and mortgages to pay, she stood up and screamed at me. She called us replaceable labor. She told me if anyone refused to drive today, they were fired." A cold fury tightened my chest. These were the men who kept our supply chain moving during blizzards and holidays. They were the backbone of Brown Freight. Thomas had worked for my family for 15 years. He had missed his own daughter graduating high school because my father needed a last-minute haul to Chicago. Calling him replaceable was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war. "Do not let anyone quit," I instructed Thomas, "and do not let them block the gates. Keep the men in the dirt overflow lot across the street. I will be there in 20 minutes. I ended the call, grabbed my leather briefcase, and headed for my car. I did not drive to the main corporate entrance. Marcus, the hired guard, was likely standing by the glass doors, eager to play hero for my father. Instead, I parked my sedan behind an abandoned diner across the street from the warehouse. I walked through the damp grass and entered the overflow lot. 30 men stood in a loose circle, murmuring in angry, hushed tones. They wore heavy work boots, stained denim, and safety vests. These were proud, hard-working men who relied on every single dollar they earned. When they saw me approaching, the murmurs stopped. The crowd parted, allowing Thomas to step forward. He held a crumpled bank receipt in his calloused hand, proving his account was overdrawn. I did not offer them empty corporate excuses. I did not give a motivational speech about family loyalty. Words do not put food on the table. Action does. I opened my briefcase and rested it on the hood of a nearby pickup truck. I pulled out my personal leather checkbook and a silver fountain pen. The men watched in stunned silence as I flipped the book open. "Thomas," I said, my voice cutting through the morning chill. "Call out the names and the net pay for every man standing here." Thomas hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Evelyn, this is your personal account. You cannot drain your own savings for this." "Call out the names, Thomas," I repeated, meeting his worried gaze. "My sister stole your livelihood to pay for her real estate. I am not going to let this crew suffer for her felony." For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in the dirt lot was the scratching of my pen and the crisp tear of paper. I wrote 30 individual checks, pulling thousands of dollars directly from my own private emergency fund. As I handed each man his owed wages, their expressions shifted from simmering anger to profound respect. They did not just see a manager handing out money. They saw the only actual leader remaining in the Brown family. My parents had hidden behind locked doors. Jessica had stolen their rent money and insulted their dignity. I stood in the mud and made them whole. Definition. When the final check was torn from the binding, I closed the book and looked at the circle of men. "Now I need a favor from all of you," I said. "I need you to walk back onto that loading dock and do your jobs." A few of the younger drivers groaned, clearly wanting to confront Jessica. Thomas raised his hand, silencing them instantly. "Listen to her," Thomas ordered. "I need Jessica to believe she won," I explained. "I need her to sit in that glass office and think she crushed a labor strike. If she believes she still has control, she will become careless. Let her think the company is limping along under her rule. We are going to let her dig her own grave, and the element of surprise is our most valuable weapon." The men nodded in silent agreement. They folded the checks into their wallets, turned around, and marched back toward the warehouse gates. They walked with purpose, ready to play their parts in the illusion. While I was securing the loyalty of the workforce, another illusion was shattering 15 miles away. David sat at the kitchen island of the upscale apartment he shared with my sister. He was nursing a headache and a deep sense of dread. Jessica had left before sunrise, claiming she had an urgent logistical crisis at the family business. David knew she was lying. He had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, haunted by the past-due credit notifications he had seen flashing on her phone during their ruined reception. He rubbed his tired eyes and walked to the front door to check the morning mail. Among the glossy catalogs and wedding vendor bills was a thick, certified envelope. The return address printed in bold black ink read, "Riverfront Bank Fraud and Compliance Division." The letter was addressed to Jessica. David stared at it. Opening another person's mail was a violation of trust. But trust had walked out the door the moment half his wedding guests abandoned the ballroom. He slid his thumb under the flap and ripped the envelope open. He pulled out a formal legal notice. His eyes scanned the dense paragraphs. Words like unauthorized signature commercial lien and frozen assets jumped off the page. The bank was formally notifying Jessica that her $500,000 loan application was under active investigation for federal forgery. David dropped the paper onto the granite counter. His legs felt weak. He braced his hands against the island, struggling to process the sheer scale of the deception. He began connecting the dots. The ruined wedding was not caused by a seating chart. The secret credit cards were just the tip of the iceberg. Jessica had forged a signature to secure a commercial loan, and when the funds were frozen, she lost her final lifeline. Then, a terrifying thought hit him. The luxury duplex. They were supposed to close on the property today. David had co-signed the mortgage application. His name, his social security number, and his pristine financial reputation were legally tied to a woman currently under investigation for bank fraud. If the federal authorities started digging into Jessica, they would dig into him too. He was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, and his new wife had tied him to the mast. He grabbed his phone from the counter. His hands shook as he scrolled through his contacts. He skipped right past Jessica's name and dialed my number instead. I had just gotten back into my sedan when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. David. I pressed answer and held the phone to my ear. "Hello, David." "Evelyn." His voice cracked. He sounded broken, devoid of the confident swagger he usually carried. "I am holding a fraud notice from Riverfront Bank. Please tell me you know what this is. Please tell me my wife did not do what I think she did." I listened to the desperation in his tone. I did not pity him, but I needed an inside man. Jessica was currently sitting in my office, transferring stolen payroll funds to secure a house they both owned. "I know exactly what she did, David," I replied calmly. "And the fraud notice is only chapter 1. "What do I do?" he pleaded. "Gather every financial document in that apartment," I instructed. "Tax returns, bank statements, the duplex escrow papers, put them in a bag, and meet me at the coffee shop on Elm Street in an hour." "I will be there," he whispered. I ended the call and started my engine. Jessica thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought stealing the payroll would save her real estate closing. She did not realize she had just funded her dream home with embezzled corporate money, and her own husband was about to hand me the keys to her destruction. The coffee shop on Elm Street smelled of roasted beans and burnt sugar. I secured a booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. 10 minutes later, David walked through the glass door. He did not look like the polished corporate accountant who had stood at the altar a few days prior. His shoulders sagged. His crisp dress shirt was wrinkled, and dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He spotted me and slid into the vinyl seat across the table. He did not bother ordering a drink. I did not offer a warm greeting or a comforting pat on the hand. Sympathy does not fix legal liability. Documentation does. I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had assembled. I placed it flat on the wooden table and pushed it toward him. "Open it," I said. David swallowed hard. His trembling fingers flipped the cardboard cover back. The first page was the Riverfront Bank commercial loan application. His eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, jumping straight to the signature line at the bottom. As a certified public accountant, his brain processed the numbers and the legal implications in seconds. "That is a $500,000 collateral lien," David whispered, tracing the forged ink with his index finger. "Against your entire freight fleet." "And that is not my signature," I replied, my voice steady. "The bank fraud division flagged it this morning. The funds are frozen." David closed his eyes. A ragged breath escaped his lips. The reality of his new wife was shattering the illusion he had married. He had fallen for a charismatic, beautiful woman who sold him a narrative of endless success. He did not know she was a financial predator. I was not finished. I reached across the table and flipped to the second document. It was a printed screenshot of the Brown Freight corporate ledger I had downloaded using my backdoor access code. I had highlighted a specific outbound wire transfer from the previous night. Look at the destination routing number on this transfer, I instructed. David studied the digits. His face turned the color of ash. That is the escrow account for the new duplex, he said, his voice barely audible. The closing deposit. When Jessica realized her forged commercial loan was locked, she panicked, I explained. She needed the real estate closing money today. So she logged into the company operating account and drained the weekly payroll. She stole the wages of 30 truck drivers to buy your house. David pressed the palms of his hands against his forehead. He looked like a man standing on the tracks, watching a freight train barrel toward him. Evelyn, she forced me to co-sign the mortgage on that property, David confessed, his voice breaking. She told me her liquid assets were tied up in a restricted mutual fund. She said she just needed my credit score to secure the prime interest rate, but she was bringing the cash for the down payment. I signed the paperwork on Tuesday. I sat back in the booth. The trap she set for him was brilliant and devastating. You understand what this means, David. You did not just co-sign a house, you co-signed a real estate transaction funded by embezzled corporate money. When the federal investigators finalize their probe into the forged bank application, they will follow the financial breadcrumbs. They will audit anyone tied to her accounts. They will look at you. He stared at me, sheer terror in his eyes. If they investigate my accounts, my accounting firm will suspend me. I could lose my CPA license. I could go to prison for a fraud I did not commit. Only if you go down with her ship, I corrected. You have a very narrow window to save yourself. You need to untangle your life from hers before she realizes the walls are closing in. Tell me what to do, he pleaded. I will do whatever say. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Do not confront her. Do not ask her about the wedding debt or the bounced paychecks. You need to go back to that apartment and act like the clueless, devoted husband. While she is distracted, you will separate your direct deposits. Move your personal savings into a new account at a different bank. Then, you will photograph every financial ledger, credit card statement, and tax document hidden in her home office. You are going to build your own defense file. David nodded slowly, his analytical mind snapping back into focus. I will get everything he promised. I will be your inside man. We stood up from the booth. He walked out of the coffee shop with a mission transformed from a victim into a vital asset. While David was preparing to dismantle Jessica from the inside, she was already losing her grip on the outside. 15 miles away, at the brown freight warehouse, Jessica sat in my ergonomic chair inside the elevated glass office. She was waiting for the inevitable explosion. She had expected a riot. She expected angry drivers to storm the building, throw their tools on the floor, and abandon their routes because their paychecks had bounced. She planned to use that chaos to call our parents, blame the failure on my sudden absence, and demand total control of the remaining corporate assets. Instead, she looked through the glass panes and saw an unsettling picture of harmony. The forklifts were moving. The loading dock was operating at peak efficiency. Thomas was barking orders, handing out manifests, and sending the trucks out on their designated routes. No one was screaming. No one was quitting. The supply chain was humming along as if nothing was wrong. Jessica stared at the warehouse floor, her mind spinning. She knew she had drained the payroll. She knew the accounts were empty. There was no logical reason for the men to be working. Panic began to claw at her throat. She needed to know what had happened. She turned to my computer terminal and pulled up the corporate banking portal. She typed in her executive login credentials, planning to erase the routing history of her illegal escrow transfer. She needed to hide the digital footprints connecting her to the stolen wages. She hit the enter key. A gray error box popped up on the screen. Invalid credentials. Please contact your system administrator. Her manicured fingers hovered over the keyboard. She tried a different password. She tried our Father Master login. She typed, frantically slamming the keys, but the result was identical. She was permanently locked out. I had not just downloaded the financial history when I used my backdoor protocol. I had changed every administrative password on the master server. I revoked her access, revoked Richard's access, and built a digital fortress around the evidence of her theft. Jessica was trapped inside a glass box, watching the company function perfectly without her, while the digital records of her felony remained securely locked away from her reach. My phone vibrated in the cup holder of my car as I drove back toward the warehouse. The caller ID flashed Jessica name. I let it ring 3 times, letting her stew in her own anxiety before I tapped the screen and connected the call. "What did you do?" Jessica screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, echoing through the speakers of my sedan. "The men are working. The server is locked. You have no right to touch those systems." I kept my eyes on the highway, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "You are going to fix this right now, Evelyn," she threatened, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I will call Mom and Dad. I will have you arrested for trespassing on the network. You are playing a very dangerous game." I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not explain that I had funded the payroll with my own savings. I did not gloat about the frozen loan or my meeting with her husband. I simply pressed the red button on my steering wheel and ended the call. Silence is the most terrifying sound to a manipulator who is losing control. By hanging up, I gave her nothing to push against. I left her alone with her paranoia confined in an office she did not earn, waiting for a consequence she could not see coming. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly where I wanted them. Now it was time to strip away her final layer of protection. My phone remained silent for exactly 2 hours after I left the coffee shop. I spent that time sitting at my kitchen island, organizing the digital files David had started sending me. He was moving with the desperate speed of a man trying to save his own life. Photographs of credit card statements, hidden tax documents, and the duplex escrow papers were flooding my secure email inbox. I was busy cataloging the sheer magnitude of her financial ruin when my screen lit up. The caller ID displayed, "My father." I answered on the first ring. Richard did not bother saying hello. His voice was rigid, inflated with a false sense of authority he had not earned. "We are holding an emergency shareholder meeting at noon," he declared. "You are required to attend in person." I knew exactly what had transpired. Jessica had run crying to our parents the moment she realized she was locked out of the corporate network. She had spun a magnificent lie, claiming I was sabotaging the servers and disrupting the warehouse operations out of spite. She manipulated their deep fear of conflict, convincing them that cutting me out entirely was the only way to restore harmony to the business. "I will be there," I replied simply, and ended the connection. I walked into my bedroom and changed into a tailored navy suit. I needed to look like an executioner, not a victim. I packed my leather briefcase with the documents that would end this charade permanently. While I fastened the brass clasps, my mind drifted to the mathematical reality of brown freight. When my grandfather started this logistics business 40 years ago, it consisted of 2 used delivery trucks and a rented garage. When he passed away, my grandmother Helen kept the books balanced. She officially handed the operational reins to Richard 20 years later. My father always possessed a massive ego, genuinely believing he built the empire himself. He conveniently forgot that Helen provided the seed money to keep the trucks running during the last major recession. When Richard officially incorporated the business, Helen quietly retained 20% of the voting shares. Richard and Diane held 30%. I earned my 40% by saving them from bankruptcy 7 years ago. Jessica possessed a meager 10% gifted to her for college expenses she never actually paid. Richard had spent the last decade acting like the sole king of the castle. He forgot the queen was still sitting on the board. I picked up my phone and dialed Helen. "It is time I told her." I arrived at the corporate office at 5 minutes to noon. I walked past Marcus, the hired security guard, without sparing him a single glance. He stepped aside, clearly instructed to let me pass for this specific meeting. I walked up the floating glass staircase to the executive boardroom on the second floor. The room smelled of lemon polish and nervous sweat. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Diane sat to his right, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jessica sat to his left. She had changed into a sharp white blazer, trying to project the image of a seasoned executive. A smug, triumphant smile played on her lips. She thought this was her coronation. She believed she had finally outmaneuvered me. I took a seat at the opposite end of the table. I placed my leather briefcase on the polished wood. I did not open it. I simply folded my hands and waited for the performance to begin. Richard cleared his throat. He refused to make eye contact with me. "Evelyn," he began, his tone formal and stiff. "Your recent behavior is completely unacceptable. You abandoned your sister at her reception. You trespassed on our digital network this morning. You have created a toxic environment for our staff." I did not interrupt him. I let him recite the script Jessica had clearly written for him. Diane chimed in, her voice shrill and accusatory. "We cannot trust you anymore, Evelyn. You are acting out of pure jealousy and spite. We have a company to run, and we cannot afford your emotional outbursts disrupting our supply chain." Jessica leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth mahogany surface. It stopped inches from my hands. "That is a formal termination agreement," Jessica said. Her voice dripped with condescension. "You are being voted out of the company for gross insubordination. You will surrender your executive keys, your network access, and your office immediately." I looked down at the paper. It was drafted poorly, filled with aggressive legal threats that held zero actual weight in a courtroom. I looked back up at her perfectly contoured face. "You cannot vote me out," I stated calmly. Jessica laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound that grated on my nerves. "Mom and Dad are voting with me," she gloated, tapping her manicured fingernails against the table. "They hold 50%. I hold 10%. That gives us a 60% majority. You only have 40. You are mathematically outmatched, Evelyn. You have zero power here. Sign the paper and leave." Right on cue, the heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. Every head turned. Grandma Helen walked into the room. She wore a pristine emerald dress and carried a thick, weathered leather ledger under her arm. The brass hinges on the old book clinked softly in the silent room. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, bypassing Richard entirely, and took the empty leather chair right next to me. "What are you doing here, Mother?" Richard asked. He sounded genuinely confused. "This is a closed executive meeting." Helen placed her leather ledger on the table. She opened the cracked cover, revealing the handwritten corporate charter from 3 decades ago. She looked at her son with utter disgust. "I am taking my rightful seat at this table," Helen declared. Her voice was firm, lacking any of the frailty usually associated with her age. "You seem to have forgotten how this business was founded, Richard. You let this spoiled child steal from the people who work for us, and you thought you could do it behind my back?" Richard blinked his mind, struggling to process her words. "Steal from us?" he stammered. "Mother, what are you talking about? We hold the majority. We are simply removing a toxic element from the board." Helen shook her head. "You do not hold a majority, Richard. You and your wife hold 30%. I own 20% of the voting shares. I never surrendered them to you." The color vanished from the face of my father. He looked at Diane, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the table. They had lived in a delusion of absolute control for so long that they forgot the actual legal structure of their own wealth. Jessica looked frantic. She pulled out her phone and opened a calculator application, her thumbs moving wildly as she tried to run the percentages. Her smug smile melted into an expression of pure horror. "Helen owns 20, I explained, watching Jessica panic. I own 40. Together, we hold a 60% supermajority. We control this boardroom. We control this company. You are the one who is mathematically outmatched, Jessica. I reached over and pushed her poorly drafted termination agreement off the edge of the table. It fluttered to the carpeted floor landing near my shoes. I unlatched my leather briefcase. The brass locks popped open with a sharp click. I pulled out a thick bound document. It was not a single sheet of paper. It was a comprehensive 50-page financial dossier. I slid it across the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my father. "I am not fired," I said, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. "But I am initiating a hostile takeover of Brown Freight." Richard stared at the heavy binder. "What is this?" he asked, his hands trembling. "That is a formal forensic audit," I replied. Jessica pushed her chair back. The metal legs scraped violently against the floor. She looked like she wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. The walls of her elaborate deception were crashing down around her. She had marched into this room expecting to strip me of my livelihood. Instead, she had walked blindly into the exact location where I would expose her crimes to the people who enabled her. "You demanded to know why I locked the servers." I continued addressing my father, but keeping my eyes locked on my sister. "I locked them to preserve the evidence. Jessica did not just forge my signature on a $500,000 bank loan this week. She has been actively draining our operating accounts for over a year." The room went deathly still. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. I was about to walk them through every single stolen dollar, and I knew the next few minutes would destroy our family dynamic forever. The heavy silence in the boardroom felt suffocating. Richard stared at the thick binder resting on the polished wood. His hands remained frozen in his lap. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of looking down. I did not give him the luxury of looking away.
"Open the cover," I instructed.
My father reached out. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped the heavy cardboard cover open. The first page was a summary spreadsheet I had spent the early morning hours compiling. It featured rows of highlighted numbers, red ink, and glaring financial discrepancies. For the past 14 months, I began keeping my voice steady and cold. Our operating costs surged. You complained about the price of diesel and blamed the rising cost of warehouse insurance. You were wrong. Our margins did not shrink because of inflation. They shrank because your youngest daughter has been bleeding this company dry. Diane shifted in her leather chair. She looked at Jessica, expecting a swift denial. Jessica sat rigidly, her posture tight. "Look at line item 4, I told my father." Richard traced his finger down the page. He squinted at the text. "It lists regular payments to a vendor called J. Lux Consulting," he read aloud. I nodded. "That is correct. Over the course of 14 months, Brown Freight issued 72 individual wire transfers to that specific firm. The total amount equals $150,000. Diane let out a sharp breath. $150,000, she repeated. What kind of consulting costs that much money? Jessica finally spoke up. Her voice was too loud for the quiet room. "It was a legitimate marketing retainer," she declared. She sat up straighter, trying to project the confidence of a seasoned executive. "I was expanding our digital footprint. I hired that firm to build our brand online, optimize our commercial outreach, and secure new freight contracts. You have to spend money to make money. It is basic business." I looked at her perfectly contoured face. She lied with such natural ease it was almost impressive. If I did not hold the receipts, my parents might have actually believed her. They wanted to believe her. They wanted any excuse to avoid the ugly truth. "Turn to page 7, I told Richard. He flipped through the binder. He found a page displaying a scanned copy of a corporate registration form filed with the state of Pennsylvania. J. Lux Consulting is not a marketing firm, I stated. It is a shell company. It is a limited liability corporation registered exactly 14 months ago. And if you look at the ownership section, you will see it belongs solely to Jessica. Richard stared at the paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I did not stop. I pressed forward, laying out the undeniable facts. She generated fabricated vendor invoices for marketing services we never received. She authorized those payouts using her executive network access. She routed corporate logistics funds directly into her own private bank account. Jessica slammed her hands onto the table. "That is a lie," she shouted. "I provided consulting services. I earned that money." I reached into the binder and pulled out a stack of printed bank statements. I fanned them out across the table. These are the expense reports for J. Lux Consulting. Let us review how you built our digital brand. 2 weeks ago, you charged a $5,000 purchase at a luxury handbag boutique in Philadelphia. Last month, you expensed 2 first-class plane tickets to Paris. There is a $10,000 wire transfer to a premier wedding planner. None of these expenses benefited Brown Freight. You stole corporate capital to fund an artificial influencer lifestyle you could not actually afford. Diane lost all the color in her face. She looked at the printed receipts, recognizing the dates and the purchases. She remembered Jessica showing off that new designer handbag, claiming it was a gift from a high-end sponsor. The illusion was shattering right in front of her eyes. Richard slumped back in his chair. He rubbed his temples. He was a man who loved the prestige of being a company president, but he despised the actual work. He hated reading spreadsheets. He hated auditing budgets. He preferred to sign whatever papers were placed on his desk so he could leave early for his afternoon golf games. His laziness was the exact vulnerability Jessica had exploited. I turned my attention directly to him. "The theft is not even the worst part of this disaster," I told him. He looked up, fear radiating from his eyes. "What could be worse than missing funds?" he asked, his voice cracking. I leaned forward. "You are the acting president of this corporation. At the end of the fiscal year, you signed the corporate tax returns. You submitted those documents to the federal government. You claimed those luxury handbags, those plane tickets, and those wedding expenses as deductible business marketing costs." Richard swallowed hard. The severity of the situation finally pierced his denial. "The Internal Revenue Service does not care if you were ignorant," I continued. "They do not care if you trusted your daughter. When they see a shell company used to funnel untaxed corporate profit into personal luxury goods, they call it tax evasion. If the government audits Brown Freight, they will pierce the corporate veil. You will be held personally liable. You are looking at severe financial penalties, the seizure of your personal assets, and potential time in federal prison." Diane let out a choked sob. "Federal prison," she whispered, her hands shaking. "Richard, tell me she is exaggerating." He could not tell her that. He knew I was telling the exact truth. He knew the legal liability rested entirely on his shoulders. Jessica panicked. The polished, arrogant bride was gone. She was a cornered thief, watching her escape routes vanish. She lunged across the mahogany table, reaching for the thick binder. She thought if she could destroy the paper, she could destroy the problem. I anticipated her movement. I pulled the binder back, sliding it safely out of her reach. She fell forward, her stomach hitting the edge of the table. She scrambled back into her chair, her chest heaving. "You are bluffing!" Jessica screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You do not have access to my private shell company records. You fabricated those papers to frame me." I rested my hand on top of the binder. My backdoor admin code gave me access to everything I said. Every deleted email, every hidden transfer. I possessed the digital footprint of every dollar you stole. Grandma Helen sat quietly beside me. She had not spoken a single word since presenting her corporate charter. She did not need to. Her silent presence validated everything I presented. She looked at Jessica with a deep, sorrowful disappointment. I looked at the three people sitting across the table. I laid out my final terms. You have two choices, I told Jessica. Option 1, you resign your executive position effective immediately. You surrender your 10% equity stake back to the company. That equity will cover the stolen $150,000. You walk away with nothing, but I keep this audit internal. I fix the tax returns and you avoid a criminal record. Jessica glared at me, pure hatred burning in her eyes. And option 2, she spat. Option 2, I replied smoothly. I walk out of this room. I drive directly to the local authorities. I hand this entire binder to an investigator. You go to jail for embezzlement, and Dad goes to prison for tax fraud. The room fell dead silent. I had presented a flawless, inescapable trap. If Richard wanted to save his own freedom, he had to force Jessica to surrender her shares. The alliance between the golden child and her enabler was fractured by the sheer weight of self-preservation. Richard looked at his youngest daughter. Sign the equity transfer, Jessica, he pleaded, his voice weak. Just give her the shares. We cannot survive an audit. Jessica stood up. Her chair crashed backward onto the carpet. She refused to accept defeat. Her pride was too vast, and her entitlement ran too deep. She looked at our parents, disgusted by their sudden willingness to abandon her. Then she looked at me. You are a monster, Evelyn, she hissed. You have always wanted to destroy me. I did not flinch. I am just a mirror, I replied. You destroyed yourself. Jessica turned on her heel. She stormed toward the exit, pushing the heavy glass door open. It slammed shut behind her, rattling the hinges. She marched down the hallway, leaving our parents sitting in stunned, terrified silence. She thought she was escaping. She thought she could simply walk away and find another loophole to fund her lifestyle. But I knew exactly how her mind worked. A predator does not stop hunting just because they miss one meal. Cornered and desperate for cash to save her sinking real estate deal, she would attempt one final, catastrophic maneuver to secure funding. She was going to target our largest outside client. She did not realize she had just walked out of one trap, only to step directly into an entirely different legal snare I had already buried in the dirt. The streetlights flickered outside my living room window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat on my sofa, holding a warm mug of herbal tea. The silence of my home usually brought me profound peace. Tonight, it felt like the quiet tension just before a severe storm makes landfall. The digital clock on my wall read 8:15. A sharp knock rattled my front door. I did not expect any visitors. I set my ceramic mug on the coffee table and walked down the short hallway. I looked through the brass peephole. My parents stood on the concrete porch. Diane clutched her designer coat tight against her chest to block the evening chill. Richard stood slightly behind her, looking down at his expensive leather shoes. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not invite them inside. I stood in the threshold, blocking the entrance with my body. Evelyn, let us in, Diane pleaded. Her voice trembled. Her eyes were red and puffy. She had clearly spent the entire afternoon crying after I left the boardroom. I stepped aside. I knew whatever they had to say would only confirm what I already believed. They walked into my living room. They did not sit down on the furniture. They stood, awkwardly, in the center of the room, looking wildly out of place in my modest home. They were accustomed to vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and grand entrances. My house was functional, clean, and paid for with my own hard-earned money. Diane broke the silence first. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her fingers felt like ice. You have to destroy that audit, Diane begged. Her voice cracked into a desperate sob. You have to delete those files from the server. If you go to the police, you will ruin her marriage. David will leave her. You will ruin her entire life over a mistake. I pulled my arm away from her grip. I took a deliberate step backward, creating physical distance between us. A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill, I replied. My tone remained flat and devoid of any warmth. Embezzling $150,000 through a shell company is a calculated crime. Forging my name on a commercial loan is a federal felony. Jessica built her own trap. I am just refusing to step inside it. Richard finally looked up. His face was pale. The stress of the afternoon had aged him 10 years in a matter of hours. He stepped in front of his wife, attempting to project the authority of a patriarch. He failed miserably. "She is your sister," Richard said. His voice was low, carrying a sickening tone of negotiation. "We are a family. We protect our own. We cannot let a federal investigator look into those accounts. If they audit the logistics business, they will take everything I own. I will lose my reputation. I will lose my country club membership." I stared at him. He did not care about the 30 truck drivers who almost lost their paychecks this morning. He did not care that I had to drain my own savings to keep his company afloat. He only cared about his afternoon tea times and his fragile social standing. "Then you should have supervised your youngest daughter," I said. "You signed the tax returns, Dad. You gave her the keys to the vault." Richard took a deep breath. He looked around my living room, refusing to meet my eyes. He was preparing to ask for the unthinkable. He had spent his entire life avoiding accountability, and he was about to ask me to carry his burden one more time. "We have a solution," Richard muttered. He rubbed the back of his neck. "A way to make this all go away without involving the authorities." I crossed my arms over my chest. "I am listening," I said. Richard swallowed hard. "You take the blame," he said. The words hung in the air. The silence in my living room became suffocating. "Excuse me," I asked. My voice dropped to a harsh whisper. Diane stepped forward again, her eyes wide with frantic hope. "It makes sense, Evelyn," she urged. "You are the managing partner. You have the administrative access. You could tell the bank and the board that you mismanaged the funds. You could say you made poor investment choices to try and grow the business." Richard nodded, quickly emboldened by his wife. "You are single, Evelyn," he reasoned. "You do not have a husband to worry about. You do not have a new family to protect. You live a quiet life. A financial scandal will not ruin your social circles because you do not care about high society. Jessica is newly married. She has a whole future ahead of her. She needs a clean slate. You can absorb this hit. We will slowly pay you back under the table." I stood frozen in the center of my living room. My chest felt hollow. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world. For 32 years, I had played the role of the reliable workhorse. I fixed their mistakes. I funded their lifestyle. I saved them from ruin. I knew they favored Jessica. I knew they overlooked her flaws because she was charming and manipulative. But I never realized the true depth of their disregard for my humanity. They did not just prefer my sister. They viewed me as a disposable shield. They were standing in my home asking me to confess to federal bank fraud and corporate embezzlement so their golden child could keep her luxury duplex. They were asking me to sacrifice my freedom, my career, and my pristine reputation just to sweep her crimes under the rug. The final thread of my familial loyalty did not just snap. It disintegrated into dust. I did not yell. I did not throw them out of my house in a fit of rage. Anger requires passion, and I felt nothing but a cold, barren emptiness toward these strangers standing in my living room. I walked over to the front door. I grasped the brass handle and pulled it wide open. The cool night air swept inside, rustling the leaves on the porch. "You have exactly 48 hours to secure legal counsel," I stated. My voice was eerily calm. "I am proceeding with the hostile takeover. I am submitting the forensic audit to the authorities on Monday morning. I am pressing charges for the forged signature. Prepare yourselves for the fallout."
Diane twisted her face into a mask of pure hatred.
The tears vanished, replaced by venom. She marched toward the door, stopping just inches from my face.
"If you do this, you are no longer our daughter," Diane hissed.
Her voice was sharp and cruel.
"We will cut you out of this family. We will disown you. You will never set foot in our home again."
I looked at her. A small, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth.
"You cannot disown someone who holds the deed to your life," I replied quietly.
Diane frowned, her confidence wavering. "What are you talking about?" I looked at my father. "You really should read the paperwork before you sign it, Dad. 2 years ago, you took out a hefty second mortgage on the family estate to pay off your private gambling debts. You defaulted on the payments 6 months later. The bank was preparing to foreclose on your house. You were going to be evicted." Richard opened his mouth, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "I bought the debt I revealed. I purchased the note from the bank through a blind trust. I did it to save you from public humiliation. I have been quietly paying the property taxes ever since. The bank does not own the house you live in. I own it." Diane staggered backward. She clutched the edge of the entryway table for support. "If you side with Jessica," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding, "if you try to interfere with my hostile takeover, or if you ever threaten me again, I will call the note due. You will not have the funds to pay me. I will foreclose on your estate and I will evict you. You will have 30 days to pack your designer bags and leave my property." The color drained from their faces. The reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They had walked into my home expecting to bully a compliant daughter. Instead, they discovered they were merely tenants living under the roof of their landlord.
"Get out of my house,"
I ordered. Richard grabbed his wife by the arm. He did not say another word. They walked out into the cold night, their shoulders slumped in defeat. I closed the heavy door and turned the deadbolt. The mechanical click echoed through the quiet hallway. I had severed the diseased branches of my family tree, and I felt nothing but relief. But the war was not over yet. Jessica was out there, terrified and running out of time. She knew the bank funds were frozen. She knew our parents could not save her now. A cornered predator will always lash out in desperation. She was going to need cash fast to survive the coming storm. I knew exactly where she would look. She would target the biggest client in our logistics portfolio. She thought she could outsmart me in the corporate arena. She had no idea I had spent 7 years building an unbreakable loyalty with our clients, and she was about to walk into a legal trap so devastating it would strip away her remaining dignity. The weekend passed in a heavy silence. Monday morning arrived with a crisp bite in the air. I sat at my desk in the main warehouse office, reviewing the final drafts of the hostile takeover documents my attorney had prepared. My parents had not tried to contact me again since I ordered them out of my house. Jessica was also missing in action. She had not shown up to the corporate lot. She had not called the dispatcher. She was invisible. I knew better than to think she had surrendered. A narcissist facing public ruin does not retreat and reflect on their mistakes. They double down. They search for a new victim. They look for a shortcut to salvage their shattered reality. Jessica was out of cash. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her husband was quietly gathering evidence against her. Our parents could no longer bail her out. She needed a substantial influx of capital immediately to save her real estate closing and pay off her high-interest credit cards. I knew she would try to exploit the company roster. I just waited to see which target she was foolish enough to choose. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, my cell phone vibrated on the desk. The screen displayed the name William Sterling. William was the regional director of logistics for a major East Coast retail distributor. His corporation accounted for 60% of the annual revenue at Brown Freight. 7 years ago, when my father nearly bankrupted our fleet, William was ready to pull his contract. I drove through a blizzard to his headquarters in New Jersey. I sat in his waiting room for 6 hours until he agreed to see me. I personally guaranteed his supply chain, and for 7 years, I never missed a single delivery window. We built a relationship grounded in concrete results and unwavering honesty. I answered the call. "Hello, William," I said. "Evelyn," William whispered. His voice echoed slightly, accompanied by the faint sound of running water and tiled walls. "I am standing in the men's restroom at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Philadelphia. Your sister invited me to an emergency lunch meeting." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I did not interrupt him. "She is sitting at a corner table right now," William continued, his tone thick with disbelief. "She just spent the last 45 minutes telling me you are suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She claims you are erratic, locking the family out of the corporate servers and actively embezzling company funds to pay for a secret gambling habit." I felt a cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. Jessica was projecting her own crimes onto me. It was a classic survival tactic. "What did she offer you?" I asked calmly. William let out a heavy sigh. "She told me the Brown Freight Board of Directors is quietly trying to remove you from power. She said the transition might disrupt the trucking routes. To protect my supply chain, she wants me to transfer my upcoming $2 million annual contract to a safe subsidiary company she controls." I tapped my pen against my desk. "Let me guess," I said. "The subsidiary is called J. Lux Consulting?" "Yes," William replied, sounding surprised. She handed me a glossy presentation folder. She said signing the transition paperwork today would guarantee my freight keeps moving while the family deals with your alleged breakdown. Evelyn, what is going on here? She is asking me to divert a 7-figure corporate account. I took a slow breath. "William," I said, keeping my voice level, "J. Lux Consulting is a shell corporation. It does not own a single delivery truck. It does not employ a single driver. It does not carry commercial freight insurance. My sister set it up to funnel stolen money to pay for her luxury lifestyle. She is currently under federal investigation for bank fraud. She is desperate for cash, and she is trying to use your contract as a lifeline." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "I am walking back out there and tearing her presentation in half," William stated. His voice hardened with professional outrage. "I will not tolerate this kind of deception." "No," I instructed sharply. "Do not tear it up. I want you to walk back to that table, shake her hand, and tell her you agree to the transition." William hesitated. "Evelyn, you are asking me to sign a $2 million logistics agreement with a fraudulent entity. My legal department will have my head." "They will not," I promised. "Because the contract she wants you to sign is going to be the exact instrument that destroys her. I need you to play along. Tell her your legal team needs to draft a specialized contract for the transfer. Tell her you will send the documents to her inbox by 3 o'clock this afternoon." "Are you setting a trap?" William asked. "I am handing her a shovel," I corrected. William chuckled softly. He knew my business tactics better than anyone. "Send me the specialized contract you want her to sign," he said. "I will forward it to her from my corporate email. Good luck, Evelyn." The call ended. I set my phone down and looked out the glass window of my office. Below me, the warehouse was a symphony of organized motion. Forklifts hummed. Drivers loaded pallets of heavy cargo. This operation required precision capital and relentless dedication. Jessica believed she could simply sign a piece of paper and inherit the revenue of this machine. She lacked the fundamental understanding of how logistics actually worked. She viewed a contract as a magical document that produced instant money. She did not comprehend that signing a commercial transport agreement meant you were legally obligated to move physical goods across state lines. I opened my email client and drafted a message to my corporate attorney. We needed to prepare a very specific legal snare. If Jessica signed a commercial logistics contract through a shell company with zero assets, zero trucks, and zero insurance, she would be crossing a terrifying legal threshold. It was no longer just internal family embezzlement. It was undeniable, documented commercial fraud against a major outside corporation. I wanted to ensure the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. I instructed my attorney to draft an airtight agreement. The contract would stipulate that JLux Consulting must execute a large-scale delivery of perishable goods within a strict 72-hour window. If the logistics provider failed to deliver the cargo on time, a severe penalty clause would trigger. The provider would become personally liable for the full retail cost of the lost goods. Jessica was blinded by her own greed. She was drowning in debt and frantic to secure a $2 million account. When William sent her the contract, she would only look at the sheer size of the payout. She would not hire a lawyer to read the fine print. She would not notice the penalty clause. She would just see a golden ticket out of her financial nightmare. 2 hours later, my attorney sent the finalized document to my inbox. It was a masterpiece of legal binding. I reviewed every clause. It left zero room for negotiation. It stripped away all standard liability protections, piercing the corporate veil of her poorly structured limited liability company. If she failed to deliver, her personal assets would be seized to cover the retail damages. I forwarded the document to William. 10 minutes later, he copied me on a blind email. He had sent the contract to the inbox of JLux Consulting. He included a brief professional note stating that Apex Distribution was thrilled to transition their supply chain to her new management, pending her immediate signature. I sat at my desk and watched my computer screen. I pictured Jessica sitting in her upscale apartment refreshing her email. I could imagine the triumphant smile spreading across her face when she saw the attachment. She would believe she had outsmarted me. She would think she had stolen my biggest client, secured her financial future, and rendered my hostile takeover pointless. At 3:45 in the afternoon, a new notification popped up on my screen. It was an automated alert from the digital signature software. Jessica had signed the contract. She did not ask for revisions. She did not request a standard legal review period. She just stamped her digital signature on the bottom line, legally binding herself to transport $5 million worth of perishable cargo across 3 state lines by the end of the week. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled a long, slow breath. The ink was dry. The snare was pulled tight. Jessica had just legally obligated a shell company with 0 trucks to perform a miracle. She assumed she could just use the brown freight fleet to fulfill the order. She believed she could simply call Thomas, give him the route manifest, and let the men do the heavy lifting while she collected the check. She did not know I was about to freeze the entire operational fleet. She did not know I was about to drop an iron curtain around the trucks, the drivers, and the warehouse. When she woke up tomorrow and realized she had no way to move the cargo she just promised to deliver, the reality of her choices would finally crush her. The clock on her strict deadline had just started ticking. The digital signature timestamp glowed brightly on my monitor. 3:45 in the afternoon. Jessica had taken the bait without asking a single question. She bound her empty shell company to a monumental logistics operation. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I reached for my desk phone and dialed the direct line to my corporate attorney. His name was Mitchell. He was a ruthless litigator who despised white-collar fraud as much as I did. He answered on the first ring. "We have her signature," I said. Mitchell let out a breath of satisfaction. "I will file the emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning," he replied. "The forensic audit is already indexed and bound for the judge. Get some sleep, Evelyn. Tomorrow, we shut down the empire." I hung up the phone. I packed my briefcase and walked out of the warehouse office. I looked down at the active loading dock. Men were shouting coordinates, diesel engines rumbled, forklifts carried heavy wooden pallets. By this time tomorrow, the entire yard would be a ghost town. I was about to freeze my own livelihood to excise a cancer from my family. It was a heavy price, but I was willing to pay it. Tuesday morning broke with a biting wind sweeping across the Pennsylvania hills. I met Mitchell on the front steps of the county courthouse. We walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator to the civil chambers. We stood before Judge Harrison, a stern man with zero tolerance for corporate theft. Mitchell laid the thick binder on the heavy oak bench. He presented the fabricated vendor invoices. He presented the shell company registration. He presented the forged commercial loan application with my copied signature. I watched the judge flip through the pages. His jaw tightened. The evidence was irrefutable. Jessica had weaponized our family business to fund a fake influencer lifestyle, and my parents had turned a blind eye to her theft. The magistrate did not hesitate. He picked up his pen and signed the emergency order. The injunction was granted. All operational assets of Brown Freight were legally frozen pending a full criminal and civil investigation. The bank accounts were locked. The commercial fleet was grounded. The warehouse doors were sealed by court mandate. The judge appointed me as the sole conservator of the frozen estate, granting me the authority to secure the premises. I walked out of the courthouse holding the signed order. I drove straight back to the logistics yard. Thomas was waiting for me near the front gates. I handed him the legal document. He read the signature from the judge and let out a long whistle. "Shut it down, Thomas," I instructed. "Tell the drivers to park the rigs. Drop the trailers in the back lot. Send the men home with a full week of pay out of my personal reserve account. Nobody loses a dime because of my sister. But nothing moves off this asphalt." Thomas nodded. He walked onto the floor and blew a loud, brass whistle. The roaring engines began to power down. The shouting ceased. One by one, the towering 18-wheelers backed into their designated parking bays. The drivers gathered their personal belongings and walked out the pedestrian gate. I hired a private security firm the night before. A black utility vehicle pulled up to the curb. 2 armed guards stepped out. They carried heavy steel chains and industrial brass padlocks. We wrapped the chains around the main iron gates securing the property. The machine was officially turned off. Brown Freight was a fortress. While I was locking the perimeter, Jessica was waking up in her upscale apartment. She poured herself an expensive coffee and opened her laptop. She was entirely oblivious to the legal iron curtain dropping over her hometown. She logged into her email. William had sent her the official freight manifest for the Apex distribution contract. It was a daunting document. 50 pallets of refrigerated goods needed to leave a New Jersey port by tomorrow evening. The cargo consisted of highly perishable seafood and imported produce. She needed 20 specialized refrigerated trailers to move the load across 3 state lines. Jessica did not panic initially. She possessed a terrifying level of arrogance. She believed she could simply use the resources I had built. She picked up her phone to call the Brown Freight dispatch office. She expected Thomas to answer the line and blindly follow her commands. She planned to fax him the manifest and let the veteran crew handle the actual labor while she collected the $2 million check. She dialed the main warehouse number. The phone rang twice. Then a recorded legal message clicked onto the line. The automated voice stated that Brown Freight was currently under a court-mandated operational freeze, and all dispatch services were suspended indefinitely. Jessica frowned. She hung up and dialed the number again. The exact same recording played. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She dialed our father. Richard did not answer. He was likely hiding in his den, terrified of the impending tax audit, refusing to look at his phone. She tried calling our mother. Diane sent the call straight to voicemail. The enablers were retreating into the shadows to save themselves. Jessica opened her laptop again. She pulled up the contract William had sent her, the document she had signed without consulting an attorney. For the first time, she actually read the fine print. Her eyes scanned past the payout figures and landed on the penalty section. The legal jargon was dense, but the ultimate meaning was brutally clear. The contract demanded a strict 72-hour delivery window. If the logistics provider failed to deliver the perishable cargo on time, a catastrophic breach clause would trigger. The clause stated the provider would become personally liable for the full retail cost of the lost goods. Jessica stared at the screen. The retail cost of the cargo was $5 million. She tried to steady her breathing. She told herself she was protected by her limited liability corporation. She told herself J. Lux Consulting would just declare bankruptcy and shield her private wealth. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had commingled her corporate funds. She had used the shell company to buy designer handbags and plane tickets. Any competent lawyer would pierce the corporate veil in a matter of minutes. The legal protections of her LLC were useless. She was personally on the hook for millions. She was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. She had no trucks, she had no drivers, she had no access to the family warehouse. The assets were frozen and the clock was ticking. She had bound herself to transport a vast fleet of goods, and she possessed zero infrastructure to move a single pallet. The illusion of her brilliant business maneuvers shattered into dust. The dominoes were falling faster than she could track. She realized I had not just cornered her. I had handed her the exact instrument of her own destruction, and she had eagerly signed her name to it. Desperation is a dangerous catalyst. Jessica knew she could not surrender. If she failed this contract, she would lose her duplex, her marriage, and her freedom. She needed trucks, and she needed them immediately. She was going to have to find a way to break through my fortress, and I was waiting for her to try. The digital clock on the screen of her laptop flipped to 9 in the morning. The 72-hour delivery window was officially open. Jessica sat at her glass dining table staring at the freight manifest William had sent her. 50 pallets of perishable seafood and imported produce were currently sitting on a loading dock in New Jersey. They needed to be transported across 3 state lines before the weekend. If the goods sat in the warm port, they would spoil. Jessica picked up her phone. Her hands felt clammy. She did not know the first thing about actual logistics. She did not know how to secure a route, calculate diesel costs, or organize a team of drivers. She only knew how to swipe credit cards and curate her online image. She opened a search engine and started looking for independent freight brokers. She dialed the first number on the list. A gruff voice answered. Jessica put on her best corporate voice, mimicking the tone she had heard our father use for years. "I need 20 refrigerated trailers at the New Jersey port by noon today," Jessica demanded. "I am the CEO of J. Lux Consulting. We just acquired the Apex distribution account." The broker on the other end let out a dry laugh. "Congratulations on the account," the man said. 20 refrigerated trailers on a same-day notice will cost you a steep premium. I need a wire transfer for $50,000 to secure the dispatch. Send me your corporate banking details." Jessica felt a tight knot form in her stomach. "I will authorize the payment through our commercial credit line," she replied quickly. The broker typed a few keys on his keyboard. "J. Lux Consulting," he muttered. "Lady, you have zero credit history. Your business rating does not exist. I do not put 20 rigs on the highway without a verified cash deposit. Send the wire or lose my number." He hung up. Jessica slammed her phone onto the glass table. She took a ragged breath and dialed a second broker. Then a third. She called 5 different regional trucking companies. Every single conversation ended the exact same way. They ran her corporate name. They saw the lack of credit history. They demanded upfront cash. She opened her banking application. She stared at the red fraud lock icon sitting next to her $500,000 loan. She checked her personal checking account. The balance was less than $400. Her credit cards were maxed out. She had no cash to pay the brokers. She was legally bound to move $5 million worth of sensitive cargo, and she did not have the funds to rent a single delivery van. Panic seized her chest. The reality of her situation began to crush her artificial confidence. She could not subcontract the work. She had to use the family fleet. She convinced herself the court injunction was just a scare tactic. She thought she could drive to the warehouse, throw her weight around, and order the drivers to take the Apex route. She believed her title and her last name still held power. She grabbed her keys, ran to her car, and sped down the highway toward the Brown Freight corporate yard. She expected to see the gates open. She expected to see trucks rolling out onto the interstate. Instead, she pulled up to a fortress. The heavy iron gates were drawn shut. Thick steel chains were wrapped tightly around the bars secured by industrial brass padlocks. 2 armed guards from a private security firm stood on the pavement. They wore tactical vests and dark sunglasses. They did not look like men who took orders from entitled executives. Jessica parked her car at a sharp angle, her tires kicking up loose gravel. She jumped out and marched up to the chain-link fence. "Open this gate right now!" Jessica shouted, pointing her finger at the closest guard. "I am an executive shareholder of this company. You are interfering with active corporate commerce." The guard did not flinch. He did not reach for his keys. He simply crossed his arms and stared at her. Jessica grabbed the cold steel chains and rattled them. The metal clanked loudly in the quiet morning air. Through the chain links, she saw the warehouse floor. The loading bays were empty. The forklifts were parked in a neat row. Then she saw Thomas. The lead dispatcher was standing near the pedestrian exit. 10 other drivers stood beside him. They were drinking coffee out of foam cups. They were not working. They were watching her. "Thomas," Jessica screamed, her voice echoing across the empty asphalt. "Bring the bolt cutters! Cut these chains and get the men in their trucks. We have a major run to New Jersey. If you do not move those rigs right now, I will fire every single one of you." Thomas did not move. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at her, but his eyes held zero respect. He looked at her with pure, unfiltered pity. It was the worst insult she could imagine. The drivers turned their backs on her and walked toward the break room. They ignored her commands entirely. Jessica pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling hands. She dialed our father. Richard answered on the second ring. "Dad, get down here right now!" Jessica cried. "Evelyn hired thugs to lock the gates. The drivers are ignoring me. I have a critical transport contract that has to move today. You need to come down here and fire these guards." Richard lived 10 minutes away. He arrived shortly after the phone call, pulling his luxury sedan up to the curb. Diane sat in the passenger seat, wringing her hands nervously. Richard stepped out of the vehicle. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive coat. He walked up to the private security guards, attempting to project the formidable aura of a corporate president. "I am Richard Brown," he announced, puffing out his chest. "I am the president of this logistics firm. You are trespassing on my property. Remove those chains immediately, or I will have you arrested for criminal obstruction." The lead guard stepped forward. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. He snapped it open and held it up for Richard to read. "This property is under a federal court-mandated freeze," the guard stated. His voice was flat and unyielding. The magistrate appointed Evelyn Brown as the sole legal conservator of this estate, pending a fraud investigation. "You have no authority here. If you touch this gate, I will detain you and call the local police." Richard read the signature of the judge at the bottom of the page. The color drained from his face. His fake authority deflated instantly. He knew he could not argue with a federal court order. If he caused a scene and the police arrived, they might start asking questions about the company finances. They might look into his tax returns. Self-preservation kicked in hard. He took a step back. He looked at the chains, he looked at the guard, then he looked at Jessica.
"There is nothing I can do,"
Richard whispered. His voice was hollow. He turned around, walked back to his car, and got inside. "Dad," Jessica screamed, running up to the window of the sedan. "You cannot just leave me here! I need trucks!" Richard did not roll the window down. Diane refused to look at her. The engine revved and the sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving their golden child standing in the dust. Jessica stood alone in the gravel lot. Her breathing turned shallow. She walked back to her car and drove to her upscale apartment. Her mind raced, processing the dense legal jargon of the contract she had signed. She had a strict delivery window. If she failed, the penalty clause triggered. She would be liable for the retail cost of the cargo. $5 million. She tried to convince herself she was safe. She told herself her LLC would shield her personal assets. She thought she could just file for corporate bankruptcy. Then a horrifying memory surfaced. She remembered paying her wedding florist using the J-Lux Consulting debit card. She remembered buying designer shoes with the business account. She had commingled her funds. Any competent lawyer would pierce the corporate veil in 10 minutes. The limited liability protection was entirely void. She was personally responsible for the $5 million. The client would sue her into oblivion. They would seize her duplex. They would garnish her wages for the rest of her life. She burst through the front door of her apartment. She needed a bailout. She needed a predatory loan, a private lender, anything to get cash today. She ran down the hallway and pushed open the door to the master bedroom. David was standing next to the bed. He had a large leather suitcase open on the mattress. He was folding a dress shirt and placing it neatly inside. He was not packing for a business trip. The closet behind him was empty. He was packing his life. Jessica ignored the obvious sign of his departure. She was too consumed by her own crisis to notice his silent exit. "David, I need your help," Jessica begged, rushing toward him. "I need a loan. You have connections in the finance sector. Find me a private lender. We can leverage your CPA license. We can use your credit score. I just need enough cash to rent 20 trucks for one day." David stopped folding his shirt. He looked at her. He did not yell. He did not demand an explanation for the forged bank application, the stolen payroll, or the hidden debt. He had spent the weekend compiling his own defense file. He already knew the truth. She was standing in front of him, asking him to commit professional suicide to save her from a fraud she created. He zipped the suitcase closed. He grabbed the leather handle and lifted it off the bed. "David, please," Jessica cried, grabbing his arm. "If I default on this contract, I lose everything." David looked down at her manicured hand gripping his sleeve. He looked back up to her face. His expression held zero affection. "You already lost everything," David replied quietly. He pulled his arm away. He walked past her, rolling his suitcase down the hallway. He opened the front door, stepped out into the corridor, and let the heavy door click shut behind him. He did not say goodbye. He did not leave a note. He just walked away, leaving her entirely alone in the silence of her collapsing world. The ticking clock of her 72-hour deadline echoed in her ears. She was out of time, out of allies, and out of lies. The final boardroom showdown was no longer a negotiation. It was going to be an execution. The 72-hour deadline expired on Thursday morning. The perishable seafood and imported produce sitting at the New Jersey port spoiled on the docks. Jessica did not secure a single refrigerated trailer. She did not move a single pallet. She failed the contract, triggering the catastrophic penalty clause. 2 hours after the deadline passed, the final reckoning began. The formal mediation took place on the 40th floor of a sleek downtown Philadelphia high-rise. My corporate attorney, Mitchell, reserved his largest conference room for the occasion. The space felt sterile and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. A long mahogany table dominated the center of the room. I sat at the head of the table, a cold glass of water resting near my right hand. I wore a sharp, black suit. My posture remained relaxed. Mitchell sat beside me, organizing a stack of legal documents. The door opened. My parents walked in first. Richard and Diane looked like hollow shells of their former selves. They wore wrinkled clothing. Richard kept his eyes glued to the expensive carpet. Diane twisted a tissue in her hands, her shoulders hunched forward. They took their seats near the far end of the table, putting as much physical distance between us as possible. A minute later, Jessica walked through the door. The polished, arrogant influencer facade was entirely shattered. Her hair hung in messy, unwashed strands around her face. She wore a faded gray sweater and plain black trousers. Dark circles bruised the fragile skin under her eyes. She looked sleep-deprived, cornered, and terrified. She brought a cheap defense lawyer with her, a man in a poorly fitted brown suit who looked like he regretted taking her case. They sat down across from Mitchell and me. Jessica refused to look at my face. She stared at her trembling hands resting on her lap. Before anyone from my family could speak, the heavy glass door opened one final time. Two men in immaculate charcoal suits walked into the conference room. They carried sleek leather briefcases. They were the senior litigators representing Apex Distribution. William had sent his best legal team to enforce the penalty clause. The two lawyers did not bother introducing themselves. They did not offer pleasantries or shake hands. They walked straight over to Jessica. The lead attorney opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. He dropped the heavy document directly in front of her. Jessica Brown, the attorney stated. His voice carried the cold precision of a scalpel. "You are officially served." Jessica stared at the document. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracked, sounding weak and frail. "That is a formal civil lawsuit for breach of contract," the attorney replied. "You failed to transport $5 million worth of perishable goods. The cargo spoiled on the loading dock. Per the specialized agreement you signed on Monday afternoon, your corporate liability protections are voided. My client is suing you for the full retail cost of the lost cargo, plus legal fees and punitive damages." The defense lawyer in the brown suit grabbed the document. His eyes scanned the first page. He flipped to the penalty clause. He read the precise legal language Mitchell had drafted. The cheap lawyer swallowed hard, realizing his client had signed an airtight financial death warrant. He leaned over and whispered something into her ear. Jessica went pale. Her mouth dropped open. She looked at the Apex attorney's panic seizing her chest. $5 million, she gasped. "I do not have that kind of money." The lead attorney adjusted his tie. "That is for the courts to decide, ma'am. We will be placing liens on your personal bank accounts and your real estate holdings by the end of the business day." The two litigators turned around and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Jessica was hyperventilating. She looked at our parents. "Mom, Dad, you have to help me," she pleaded. "You have to liquidate your retirement accounts. You have to sell the family estate. They are going to take everything." Richard kept his head down. Diane covered her face with her hands and began to weep silently. They had nothing left to give her. I owned their mortgage, and their shares in the logistics company were frozen by a federal judge. I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down. The condensation left a small ring on the polished wood. "Nobody is liquidating anything to save you, Jessica," I said. My voice cut through the quiet room, drawing every eye toward me. "Your safety net is gone." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 3 thick manila folders. I placed them in a neat row in front of me. I slid the first folder across the smooth mahogany table until it stopped in front of my sister. "Open it," I instructed. Her cheap lawyer reached out and flipped the cover back. That is a formal confession of judgment, I explained. It details your 14-month history of embezzling $150,000 from Brown Freight. It details the fake vendor invoices. It also includes the undeniable proof that you forged my signature to secure a commercial bank loan. Jessica stared at the paper. Her lower lip trembled. I slid the second folder down the table. It stopped directly in front of my father. Richard stared at the cardboard cover, too terrified to touch it. That is a deed of transfer, I told him. You and Mom enabled a thief. You signed fraudulent corporate tax returns to protect your favorite child. When the Internal Revenue Service audits the logistics firm, they will impose severe financial penalties. You are going to sign over your remaining 30% equity in Brown Freight to me right now. Your shares will serve as collateral to cover the incoming federal fines you created. Richard closed his eyes. Tears leaked through his wrinkled eyelids. He reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the folder closer. He knew he possessed zero leverage. He had lost his company, his legacy, and his pride. I picked up the third and final folder. I looked directly at Jessica. I slid the heavy cardboard across the table. It bumped against the first folder resting in front of her. She did not wait for her lawyer this time. She opened the cover herself. She read the bold header printed at the top of the page. It was a divorce petition. David filed it this morning in family court, I stated. My tone remained flat, offering zero pity. He cited severe financial abuse and fraud as the primary grounds for the dissolution of the marriage. He already submitted his defense file to the bank investigators. He proved you forced him to co-sign a luxury duplex funded by stolen corporate payroll. He is untangling his life from yours, and he is leaving you with the wreckage. Something inside Jessica snapped. The reality of her total defeat short-circuited her brain. The arrogance she had worn like armor for 32 years shattered into jagged pieces. She let out a guttural, primal scream. She lunged across the mahogany table. Her hands curled into claws reaching for my face. She knocked over her chair, her knees slamming onto the polished wood. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. Her defense lawyer reacted instantly. He grabbed her by the shoulders and yanked her backward. He pulled her down hard into her seat, holding her arms pinned against her sides. "Sit down and shut your mouth," the lawyer hissed in her ear. "You are about to catch an assault charge on top of federal fraud. Stop talking." Jessica thrashed against his grip, sobbing uncontrollably. "You ruined my life!" she screamed at me, tears streaming down her face. "You planned this! You took my husband! You took my house! You took everything!" I stared at her thrashing figure. "I did not take anything," I replied softly. "You handed it all to me on a silver platter." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I looked at the 3 broken people sitting across from me. It was time to deliver the final ultimatum. "Here are your terms," I announced. My voice left zero room for negotiation. "You are going to sign that confession of judgment, Jessica. You will surrender your remaining 10% equity in the company. You will hand the keys to the luxury duplex over to the bank to settle your fraudulent escrow transfer. You will walk out of this room with empty pockets, zero assets, and zero connection to this family." Jessica shook her head frantically. "No," she sobbed. "I will not sign it." Mitchell, my attorney, spoke for the first time. He tapped his pen against his notepad. "If you refuse to sign the settlement today, Miss Brown, my client will not file civil charges." Jessica looked at him, a tiny spark of confused hope lighting in her eyes. Mitchell pulled his cell phone from his pocket and placed it on the table. Instead, Mitchell continued, his voice cold. "I will press this button. I have the federal prosecutor handling commercial bank fraud waiting on speed dial. If you do not sign these papers in the next 60 seconds, I will call him. He will dispatch federal agents to this building. You will leave this conference room in handcuffs. You will stand trial for felony forgery and embezzlement. You will face a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The spark of hope died instantly. Sign the papers, Jessica Richard pleaded. His voice broke into a pathetic whimper. He picked up a pen and began signing his own transfer documents, surrendering his 30% stake without reading another word. Diane sobbed louder, hiding her face behind her hands. Just sign them! We have nothing left! Jessica looked at her parents. She looked at her cheap lawyer. The lawyer gave her a grim nod, confirming Mitchell was not bluffing. She was trapped. She had no money to fight a federal indictment. She had no allies to hide behind. She had exhausted every lie, every manipulation, and every shortcut. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the silver pen resting on the table. She pulled the confession of judgment toward her. She pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line. She signed her name. She did not trace my letters this time. She signed her own name, legally confessing to the financial ruin of her own life. She dropped the pen. It rolled across the wood and clattered onto the floor. I watched her sign the final page. The war was officially over. I had secured total control of the empire I built, and I had permanently removed the parasites feeding on my success. The dust was settling, and the final outcome of their betrayal was about to take shape. 6 months passed. The cold Pennsylvania winter melted into a bright, humid spring, and the dust finally settled on the ruins of my former family. I stood behind the glass wall of the newly renovated executive office at Brown Freight. The old oak desk my father used to hide behind was gone. In its place stood a sleek glass conference table and a digital tracking board displaying our real-time logistics routes. I held a steaming mug of coffee and looked down at the warehouse floor. The space was unrecognizable from the chaotic morning the paychecks almost bounced. The floor hummed with organized precision. 50 new refrigerated trailers sat in the expanded loading bays. We had not just survived the Apex distribution fiasco. We absorbed the $2 million contract the moment Jessica defaulted on it. William transferred the account directly to my management, and our profit margins doubled in a single quarter. The glass door to my office opened. Thomas walked in holding a clipboard. He did not wear a stained safety vest anymore. He wore a crisp, button-down shirt and a tie. The morning dispatch is clear, Evelyn Thomas said, handing me the logistics report. All 20 trucks are on the highway ahead of schedule. I scanned the paper and handed it back. Thank you, Thomas, I replied. Excellent work this week. Thomas smiled a genuine expression of pride. He had earned his new title as Vice President of Operations. When I took total control of the company, my first executive decision was promoting the man who actually kept the fleet running. I doubled his salary. I implemented a profit-sharing program for the drivers. The men did not just work for a paycheck anymore. They owned a piece of the success they built. Loyalty is a two-way street, and I made sure my crew was rewarded for staying on my side of the fence. I am the 100% sole owner and CEO of Brown Freight. There are no silent partners. There are no hostile buyouts hiding in the shadows. The empire belongs to me. The people who tried to steal it are currently living a very different reality. Richard and Diane did not go to federal prison. I kept my word. I fixed the fraudulent tax returns and paid the staggering IRS penalties out of the corporate reserve. But salvation came with a heavy price tag. They surrendered their 30% equity to me to cover the fines. They lost their primary source of income. Without the logistics revenue funding their country club lifestyle, their financial house of cards collapsed in weeks. They were forced to list the massive family estate on the market. They sold the house at a brutal loss just to clear their private gambling debts and outstanding credit lines. The sprawling lawns and crystal chandeliers were replaced by a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Harrisburg. I heard through the industry grapevine that Richard tried to apply for consulting jobs. Nobody returned his calls. His reputation in the logistics world was entirely destroyed. Diane lost her social standing the moment she had to sell her designer handbags on consignment. They now live on fixed Social Security checks. They clip grocery coupons. They share a single aging sedan. The pristine image they spent decades cultivating evaporated the moment they lost my bank account. On Thanksgiving morning, my phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, a notification popped up. It was an audio message from Diane. She sounded frail and desperate. She begged me to come to their small apartment for dinner. She talked about forgiveness and family bonds. She did not apologize for demanding I take the fall for a federal felony. She just wanted her safety net back. I deleted the voicemail. I opened my phone settings and blocked the number permanently. You do not invite a parasite back into your home just because it is hungry. Jessica experienced an even steeper fall from grace. The day she signed the confession of judgment in Mitchell's office was the last day she wore expensive clothes. The apex litigators did not show her an ounce of mercy. When they realized her shell company was bankrupt, they pierced the corporate veil, exactly as I predicted. They seized her personal bank accounts. They placed a heavy lien on her future earnings. The bank foreclosed on her luxury duplex before she even unpacked her boxes. The property was auctioned off to cover the fraudulent escrow transfer she initiated when she stole our payroll. David did not wait around for the dust to settle. His annulment petition went through the family court system with lightning speed. He submitted his defense file to the judge, proving Jessica committed severe financial fraud and trapped him in predatory debt. The judge granted the annulment and severed his financial ties to her entirely. David walked away clean. He kept his CPA license, he kept his job. He erased her from his life as if she never existed. Jessica had no degree. She had no marketable skills. She had a massive legal restitution order hanging over her head. The court garnished her wages to repay the stolen $150,000 she owed me. She currently works as a cashier at a local grocery store in the suburbs. She wears a polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She stands under harsh fluorescent lights for 8 hours a day, scanning barcodes and bagging produce. She hands change to the same wealthy women she used to invite to her influencer parties. Every week, a substantial portion of her minimum wage paycheck is automatically routed to my corporate account. It will take her decades to pay off the debt. She tried to steal an empire, and she earned a lifetime of scanning canned goods instead. A soft knock on the glass door pulled me from my thoughts. Grandma Helen walked into the office. She wore a bright yellow cardigan and carried a warm glass dish wrapped in a checkered towel. The smell of baked apples and cinnamon filled the room. "I brought dessert," Helen said, setting the homemade pie on the glass conference table. I smiled and walked over to her. I pulled out a leather chair and we sat down together. Helen looked out the window, watching the forklifts move pallets of cargo across the warehouse floor. She watched Thomas directing a new driver near the loading bays. "Your grandfather would be proud of this place," Helen said softly. Her eyes crinkled at the corners. "He built this business with a single truck, but you built it into a fortress." "We built it, Grandma," I corrected her. I cut a slice of the warm pie and placed it on a small plate for her. "You saved the voting shares. You sat at the table when I needed you most." Helen took a bite of the pie and nodded. "I just reminded Richard who owned the bricks," she said. "You are the one who laid the mortar." We sat in comfortable silence for a long time. I looked out over the thriving company. My mind drifted back to the night of the wedding. I remembered the sound of the chair scraping against the marble floor. I remembered the cold, arrogant look on my sister's face when she pulled the seat out from under me and declared I was not family. She thought excluding me from a table would break my spirit. She thought public humiliation would force me to surrender my life's work. She misunderstood the fundamental nature of power. True power does not come from a designated seat at a dinner party. It does not come from a designer dress or a fake online persona. True power comes from doing the hard work in the shadows. It comes from knowing the numbers, owning the dirt beneath the building, and refusing to bend the knee to entitled manipulation. Jessica tried to kick me out of my seat at the family table. All she managed to do was give me the unyielding motivation to buy the entire room, lock the doors, and throw her out into the cold. If you are the person in your family who carries the weight, who fixes the mistakes, and who pays the bills while receiving zero respect, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You do not owe your success to people who treat you like a disposable asset. You are allowed to stop writing the checks. You are allowed to gather your documents, secure your boundaries, and walk away. Never sacrifice your own peace to fund someone else's entitlement. Your loyalty should only belong to the people who stand up when your chair is pulled away. Thank you for listening to this story on Grape Vengeance. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice boundaries and building a life you truly own. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.